Yeah, I mean, it was this big thing.
Always, it's been stupid.
There's always this sort of
Hola.
we can.
This is like to sorry, to remove the audio from both of them because they are like overlapping.
Okay. Well, should I sit a bit further away? Maybe is it because
okay, let's do that. But still.
What were you two? I didn't hear this. Oh,
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Through Caseica webinar series. My name is Angelica Santiago, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Manchester, and I will be chairing today's webinar. This second webinar is focused on the use of liquid biopsies for cancer diagnosis and treatment. The use of non-invasive procedures has considerable potential to provide information about the disease state of cancer patients without the need of an invasive biopsy. With a drop of blood of a cancer patient, we can find circulating free DNA or circulating tumor DNA, circulating tumor cells, tumor-educated platelets, exosomes and extracellular vesicles, and also metabolites that can be used as a blood-based biomarkers. Today we have Dr. Dominic Rodwell and Dr. Eloisa Jantus that will tell us about circulating tumor cells and circulating tumor DNA in the context of lung cancer. Before introducing our first speaker, I would like to give you some brief instructions about using GoToWebinar and making questions. So just in case this is the first time that you use this platform. In the control panel that appears on the right-hand side of your screen, towards the bottom of part of this panel, there is either a question tab or a chat tab. So please write and send your questions during the talk, and they will be answered after each speaker's talk. So we are going to start, and it's a pleasure to introduce to you to Dr. Dominic Rothwell, who is a senior scientist at the Clinical and Experimental Pharmacology Group within the Cancer Research UK Institute here in Manchester. Since he started his career, he's been interested in looking for molecular biomarkers, first in multiple myeloma and currently in non-small cell lung cancer. So thanks, Dominic, for joining us, and we are looking forward to hear your talk.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Angelica, for the introduction, asking me to speak this evening. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is give an insight into some of the work that we've been doing. Some of the work we've been doing on utilizing CTCs and ctDNA in a clinical setting to really address the question, are we there yet clinically? Can we use these? So one of the main drivers that we've had in this area of research has been the development of personalized medicines that I'm sure you're all aware of over the last few years have been a success in cancer therapy. And if you look at the molecular drivers in a number of diseases, for instance, the panel here on the left shows the makeup for non-small cell lung cancer and melanoma, then you find that there are a number of different genes tend to be mutated, and the actual mutations within these genes are quite different. And so there's this heterogeneity at the actual molecular level drives that drives the disease. This explains the responses you get in patients when you treat them as a whole, where you get some patients respond well, some patients respond poorly. So with a personalized medicine approach, you can identify the actual activating driver mutation in those patients, and there's an associated therapy, then you can potentially get an improved overall response in this stratified cohort of patients. So a great example of that is the use of BRAF inhibitors in melanoma, that's shown here. So this is data from the JCO paper from a few years ago now. So this is a melanoma patient that's obviously got large numbers of metastatic lesions across his body. However, the melanoma was identified as having a BRAF V16E mutation. The patient went on to a BRAF inhibitor, and he got this amazing response. He got massive responses to the inhibitor. So these personalized medicine approaches do work. So to be able to use these approaches, then you need to determine the molecular characteristics or do molecular analysis of the cancer. And the way that this is done, the gold standard for this at the moment is the use of tumor biopsies. So these can either be tumor biopsies, sort of CT guided, as shown here in the top right-hand panel, or it can be the use of tumor resections that have been taken at curative surgery. However, the use of these tumor biopsies have got limitations. The actual CT biopsies, for instance, are invasive, they're expensive, and they're not without potential risks. And also things like the use of tumor resections. These could be taken quite a long time before the actual patient relapses. So the patient relapses 3, 4, 5 years down the line. Then the question is, do the mutational profiles of these biopsies actually truly reflect what's happening in the patient at the time that you're interested in? Other limitations with tumor biopsies is you can often get limited amounts of material. Also, the patient's got multiple metastatic lesions. It's difficult to biopsy them all, which one is clinically important. And one of the major limitations with these approaches is that you can't easily collect serial biopsies. To be able to do serial biopsies, which will allow you to better understand what's happening in those patients, then it's ethically difficult to get these from a patient. So because of these reasons, then we've had a long-standing interest in the group for the use of liquid biopsies. So for this is mostly for the main of this talk, we're talking about a blood sample. So the advantage of using a blood sample is that its collection is non-invasive, and it's inexpensive, and it's easy to do, so you can collect them longitudinally off patients. These blood samples, or these liquid biopsies, allow you to do real-time monitoring of the tumor status. By that I mean what's happening in the patient at that moment that the blood's taken is reflected in the analysis that you do. It does this longitudinal analysis that I've just discussed that is extremely advantageous, which allows us to potentially look at or identify mechanisms of resistance, which will then help potentially improve the clinical management of these patients. So the bottom half of this slide, if you look at the different analytes you can get from a blood sample, as Angelica said at the start, there's a whole range of different potential analytes, and in the lab we're interested in most of these, but clinically we really sort of focus on two: that's circulating tumour cells and circulating tumour DNA. So just as a bit of a oversight for anyone who's not familiar, so circulating tumour cells were first described a long time ago in 1869. They are cells that are thought to be derived from the primary tumour and play a role in metastatic disease spread. We and other groups have shown that they're clinically important. CTC number is prognostic in lung cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, and they're thought to have an invasive tumour stem cell-like phenotype. Because they're in the blood sample, then the idea is we can use them as this surrogate tumour material that we can use to molecularly characterize the patient. However, working with CTCs has got a number of disadvantages. The first is that they are very rare cells, so you're lucky if you get 1 to 100 cells in maybe a ml of blood. So to put that into context, that's maybe one cell in a background of 50 million normal cells, and so you've got to do the actual enrichment and isolation of cells from a high background. Once you've isolated your cells, you've then got the challenge of single cell analysis. So to be able to analyze these cells, you've got to go down to single cell, whole genome modification, and the sort of technical limitations or difficulties you get with that. An advantage of looking at CTCs is that it gives you insight into tumor heterogeneity, and because they're metastatic, potentially metastatic disease, and because it's a blood sample, it allows you to do this, potentially look at this longitudinal analysis. Excuse me. So the other analyte that we're interested in is circulating tumor DNA. So this is released into the plasma following apoptotic and necrotic death of tumor cells. Again, limitations of working with ctDNA can be that the concentrations tend to be low, typically maybe 5 nanograms of cfDNA per ml of plasma. The DNA is also highly fragmented. It's a very tight 150 to 170 base pairs DNA fragments, which is basically a single DNA wound around a nucleosome. And the biggest difficulty with working with circulating tumor DNA is the background of normal cfDNA that comes associated with it. So normal cells in your bodies are obviously dying and being replaced, and it's this normal cfDNA background can dilute out the tumor fraction that you're interested in and pose technical difficulties. The advantage of circulating tumor DNA is, compared to CTCs, for instance, is that it's much simpler to collect. And again, it's a blood sample, so you can do longitudinal analysis. It really does show real-time analysis. The half-life of circulating tumor DNA is thought to be about 2 hours, so it really is reflecting what's happening with the patient. And also the other advantage is that circulating tumor DNA is thought to be released from all disease types, so if you've got numerous lesions within the patient, looking at the circulating tumor DNA will give you a global picture rather than just isolating restricting you to look at just one of the lesions. So we've spent a lot of time in the group coming up with a pipeline that allows us to look at CTCs and ctDNA from clinical samples. So this is a simple overview of that. So we tend to work with a preserved blood sample to start with. This enables us to collect samples from distant sites for either clinical trials or for international collaborations, for instance. Once we've collected the blood, we isolate the plasma, and then we can enrich our cellular fraction from which we do our CTCs. We've got a nice piece of kit called a DEP array, which allows us to do single cell isolation for our CTC analysis. From the plasma, we extract ctDNA. From once we've isolated our single CTCs, we then do whole genome amplification. And then from both of these processes, one of our preferred routes of analysis is NGS based. And using NGS, we can do everything from all exome sequencing to look for potential mutations across the genome. Targeted NGS if we want to look at a smaller gene panel, probably more sensitivity. And we can also do low-pass whole genome sequencing, which allows us to identify copy number changes in these samples. And we can use both approaches for either ctDNA or for single-cell CTCs. So for the rest of the talk, I'll talk about a couple of the projects that we've done using this pipeline. One is using CTCs in small cell lung cancer patients to determine chemo response. And then the final part of the talk, I'll talk about some of the work we're doing with ctDNA on a target trial. Excuse me. Okay, so CTCs in small cell lung cancer. So we're interested in a couple of clinical questions in small cell lung cancer. And the problem with this disease is it's very difficult to get tumor biopsies. And so the first question we asked was, can we use CTCs in place of tumor biopsies to better understand the biology of the disease? Can we use CTCs basically as a surrogate tumor material? And if we isolate CTCs, can we actually molecularly characterize them and use them to potentially identify informative clinical biomarkers? And one of the questions we wanted to ask was the difference between intrinsic and acquired resistance. So in small cell lung cancer, about 80% of patients respond well to chemotherapy initially, but unfortunately they become resistant to the treatment and they have an acquired resistance, and the 5-year survival for the disease is less than 10%. So the question is, can we get some insight into the acquired resistance mechanism? The remaining 20% of patients unfortunately don't respond to chemotherapy, and these have got an intrinsic resistance. So the question is, if we get CTCs and do molecular analysis of the tumor material, can we identify the potential differences between these two phenotypes? So the way we went about the project is we used the pipeline I've just described. So we collected our blood samples and did CTC enrichment. For this, we used a cell search system, which is FDA approved and enriched to CTCs based on EpCAM positive and cytokeratin expression. We then used our deparator to isolate single cells and then generated whole genome sequencing, next generation sequencing material for NGS analysis. So we did this initially on 13 small cell lung cancer patients, which resulted in analysis of nearly 90 CTCs. So the analysis that we did in this project was a copy number analysis using low-pass whole genome sequencing. That's shown in the bottom left-hand panel. So what you basically do is you sequence your genome and you count the number of reads you've got across the genome. Regions that have got more reads than you expect indicate reasons of amplification, shown in red. Regions that have got less reads than you expect indicate regions of deletions, as shown in blue. So the bottom right-hand panel of the slide shows the data that we got from 13 genes, which have been previously described to be amplified or deleted in small cell lung cancer. Each of the columns on the heat map is a single CTC, and what you can see is globally, looking at single cell analysis, we got the patterns of amplifications and deletions you'd expect in this disease. So it gives us confidence in the single cell data we were generating. So if you look at the global copy number changes in these patients, so again, what we've got here is we've got 13 patients. Each column is a single CTC. Blue is deletions, red are amplifications. And if you look at the patterns across the different across the 13 patients, then you can see that there's high levels of both inter and intra-patient heterogeneity at the copy number level in this disease. We're getting lots of changes which are different between patients, but also within patients. For instance, patient 13 at the end, you're getting changes which are actually different between the CTC, so you're getting evidence of intra-patient heterogeneity. So the question we wanted to see was, are any of these changes associated with chemo response? So we did unsupervised PCA analysis, and though it's not completely separate, you do tend to get a separation between the chemosensitive and chemorefractory patients shown in the PCA on the left. So we did a lot of bioinformatic analysis of this data, and what we did is we ended up identifying 16 regions within the chromosome which were capable of discriminating between these chemosensitive and chemorefractory patients. So if you look at the separation of the two populations on this classifier, then you get nice separation here. But you'd expect this because this is the data that you generated your classifier on. So to test it, we went back and collected another 18 small cell lung cancer patients, which is another 112 CTCs. Again, this is the global copy number data you get from this cohort of patients. Again, each column is a single CTC. And we put this data back through our classifier to see whether we could accurately predict which patients were chemosensitive, which patients were chemorefractory. So if we did this, we correctly classified 15 of the 18 patients. If you combine this with the training set, then we ended up with an overall accuracy of 90%. We also tested it in a cohort of small cell mouse models that we've got in the laboratory, and again, we've got about a 90% accuracy. So we have identified a CTC-based classifier which has got the potential to actually identify which patients will or won't benefit from chemotherapy. If you compare this to the clinical data, so these are a couple of Myers of showing the progression-free survival. On the left-hand side, it's just the clinical follow-up. The purple line is chemorefractory patients. The green is chemosensitive. And then what we've done on the right-hand side is we've taken the patients. So this is based on a blood sample that was taken pre-treatment, and we just generated the CTC classifier and predicted whether the patient would be chemosensitive in green or chemorefractory. And again, we get good separation of these patients. So it looks like we've got a blood-based biomarker that enables us to potentially identify the patients that will not benefit from chemotherapy. So what we're doing now is we're taking this project further forward, increasing the number of patients and trying to further refine and improve the sensitivity of the classifier. Okay, so that's an example of using CTCs. For the last part of the talk, I'll talk about one of the projects we're doing based on circulating tumor DNA analysis, and this is the Target trial. So as I'm sure all of you are aware, there's been lots of interest in the use of circulating tumor DNA, particularly in the clinical setting over the last few years. However, to be able to use it, we thought there's three critical clinical questions that need to be addressed. If we want to use circulating tumor DNA to identify potentially clinically important mutations, then can we do this reliably enough to be able to put it into a clinical setting? The next question is if we can identify these mutations, can we actually generate the data and report it back to a molecular tumor board in a clinically relevant timescale? Can we get the infrastructure in place that facilitates this? And the third question really is if you can identify the mutations and report them back, does it actually improve the actual clinical outcome for patients with solid cancer? So it was having these three questions in mind, we developed the Target trial 2 or 3 years ago. So this is a collaborative study between the Christie Hospital site here in Manchester, CRU UK, and the Manchester Centre for Genomic Medicines. So the trial split up into 3 parts. Part A1 was looking at 20 patients just to answer question 1, can we actually reliably identify mutations from the circulating tumor DNA of patients with solid cancer? Part A2 was to ask the feasibility question. If we identify these mutations, can we actually report them back? Can we put the infrastructure in place to collect the bloods, generate the data, and report it back to the clinicians in a meaningful manner that was clinically acceptable? And then the third part, Part B, was if we could succeed in parts A1 and A2, then we start using this in a clinical setting. Does it improve outcome, which is answering our third question. So the way we do it is shown schematically here. So each patient we collect a blood sample from, and there's also a tumor biopsy collected. From the blood sample, we do cfDNA isolation, and we identify potential mutations in a panel of 650 cancer-associated genes. We can then compare this to the tumor data. This is done in an ISO-accredited laboratory, but it's only looking at 24 genes. And then the question is, can we report these back to a molecular tumor board for clinical decision, to help in clinical decision-making for these patients? So to develop the ctDNA pipeline, there was 4 main steps. The first one was isolation of the cfDNA from the plasma. So for this, we developed a QIAGEN Symphony. So by automating it, we made the cfDNA isolation more reliable, and meant that the numbers of patients we could analyze greatly increased. The next step was the actual process of doing the NGS analysis. For this, we chose a pull-down chemistry using adjuvant pull-down SureSelect process. As I said, we identified a panel of 650 genes which are associated with cancer, so this gives us high coverage to be able to identify potential clinically important mutations. We use NextSeq to generate our data, and the fourth part is bioinformatics, and this is really over the last couple of years proven to be one of the most important steps of the analysis. Because we're working on circulating tumor DNA, the analysis is different when you're looking at tumors, and actually the process that you do for your bioinformatics really influences the quality of data you get out. So over the development of the trial, the actual bioinformatics have evolved. So what we've got now is shown here in this slide. So we do our NGS runs. So we run one high throughput high-seq run for 4 patients. That's 8 samples, and we get about 50 million reads per sample. And we run the germline and the ctDNA sample for each patient. We then do BCL FASTQ conversions, and we run our data through 2 independent variant calling software packages. Mutations that are called from both package, we report as high confidence, and then report these back to the tumor board with the aim of getting this back to patients, to the clinicians within 28 working days. So for the first part of the trial, part A1, as I said, we looked at 20 patients for the feasibility of the actual trial. So we showed that we could generate data from all 20 patients. We had a 100% success rate. Our average read depth is about 300 reads per nucleotide. 75% of the patients, 15 of them, we identified at least one mutation in the cfDNA, and our report there was 34 days, working days. So that was quite long initially, but a lot of that was actually setting up the bioinformatics and the molecular tumor board, and this has improved, as you'll see in the next couple of slides. So the first question that we asked was the concordance that we got between circulating tumor DNA and circulating tumor DNA in the tumor, and we found that this was very good. So it was 90%. 18 of the 20 patients showed the same mutational profile, either absence or presence of mutations, and of the 11 mutations that were identified in the tumor, we picked up 9 of them in circulating tumor DNA. So patient 6, we just didn't pick up the EGFR mutation. This was probably below the level of detection in our assay. Interestingly, for target patient 7, there was a PIK3CA mutation identified initially in the tumor, but this was wasn't present in the circulating tumor DNA from this patient. Interestingly, though, this patient had a second biopsy taken at the time of the blood sample, from which a PDX was derived, and both the PDX and the biopsy failed to have this PIK3CA mutation. So this looks like an example. The initial biopsy was about 3 years old. So this looks like an example of where the actual tumor has evolved and the actual mutational profile has changed, and the actual ctDNA was truly reflecting what was happening with the patient at the time. So part A1 was a success. We then got the go-ahead to move on to part A2. So this is expanding the cohort up to 100 patients. So we started this in the beginning of 2016 and completed it at the end of last year. So across the 100 patients, we've generated data from 21 different cancer types, whatever the clinicians were interested in. We managed to report cfDNA NGS data for 99 of the patients, good average read depth of nearly 800 reads, and our report times for the last 20 patients for the 100 patients is reduced now down to 24 days. For the last 20 patients that we reported, this has actually now gone down to 16 days, so we are doing this clinically feasible sorts of reporting. From the patients, we maintained about 75% of the patients had at least one point mutation. If you look at concordance between the tumor and the ctDNA, again, this was up at 85%. Again, this is limited to the 24 gene panel because that's all that's measured in the ISO accredited NHS lab, but the majority of mutations are concordant. We did, as shown in the blue boxes above the graph, find examples of where the mutation was present in the tumor but was absent from the ctDNA. This could be biological, it could be lack of below the level sensitivity of the assay. We also picked up examples of where the mutation was present in ctDNA but absent from the tumor. An interesting case of this is the one highlighted in red, so target 39. So this patient had a KRAS mutation present in the ctDNA that wasn't found in the tumor, and it turns out that this patient was treated with panitumumab, in which a KRAS mutation is a known mechanism of resistance. And so what we think is that patients actually evolved a mechanism of resistance, which was picked up in the ctDNA. And so we are getting a number of examples where you get interesting data from this. Interesting, there was no significant association between biopsy age and actual mutational concordance in this cohort of patients. So ultimately, the question that we're trying to address with this sort of treatment is, can we match patients to targeted therapies? So from the 100 patients that we've treated in part A1 and A2, 41 were identified from either tumor or cfDNA to have actual mutations, and 11 of these have been recruited to match clinical trials. So this matches a number of publications that have come out recently, the Moscato trial, for instance, where about 7 to 10% of patients can be matched to targeted therapies. This clinical data is not in fruition yet, but hopefully we'll be able to report on it in talks soon. So if we go back to our 3 clinical questions, can we reliably identify clinically important mutations? Then part A1 proved that we could. Can we report these back to molecular tumor board for clinical analysis in a relevant timescale? Part A2 showed that we could do this. So the last question was, if we do and we react on these mutations, does it improve clinical outcome? So to do that, is the aim of the last part of the trial, which is part B. So that's shown here in this slide. So we're now going to recruit an additional 250 patients. This has been open just over a year now. All the data I've presented so far was generated from an initial blood draw, but we've actually adapted the trial now to allow us to do this longitudinal analysis, which I've gone on about, which we will hopefully will be useful. So the idea is now in these patients, we can actually collect multiple blood samples and do monitoring. Then if the patient does progress, we can actually readdress the potential mutations we identify in the cfDNA to come up with alternative treatments. We're also included the ability to generate PDX and CDX models from these patients, and the idea is if you identify potential actual mutations, you can test these animal models. If it works, and you've got some justification to go back to the patients. So my very last slide, I'll just give one example of a patient from part B. So this is a 71-year-old lady that presented with non-small cell lung cancer, October 2015. She initially had surgery with curative intent, but unfortunately relapsed at the end of 2017. She was recruited to the target trial, but her conditioning was deteriorating and she was in a hospice. So we did the tumor and the ctDNA analysis. So the tumor identified a KRAS mutation, but the ctDNA analysis identified a whole slew of different mutations that weren't picked up in the tumor. So this was unusual because normally the concordance between tumor and ctDNA is very good. So we were a bit worried. We did SNP analysis to convince ourselves that we were working on the correct material, and we were. And then what it turns out, if you go into the clinical records of this patient, then the patient initially had 2 different primary tumors. So the initial primary tumor was resected, and that's what had the KRAS mutation. However, there's a second primary tumor that is contributed to the relapse, and we've looked at the mutational profile. In this, we identified an EGFR mutation that was highly prevalent in this patient. So what we did is, based on this ctDNA analysis, the patient was put onto an EGFR inhibitor, alitinib, which resulted in a partial response and significant clinical improvement. Subsequently, a liver met was taken in this patient, and this EGFR mutation was confirmed. So this is a great example of where if you'd acted on the historic tumor biopsy, the patient wouldn't have had a clinical option, but using the relevant ctDNA analysis, then it gives us clinical options for this patient. Okay, so obviously there's lots of people to acknowledge. I won't name them all, but to do this science takes big teams, and this is all done under the tutorage of Professor Caroline Dowd. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dominic. That was really interesting presentation with lots of data from different themes, and we have some questions. So I think you already saw that liquid biopsy is helping to study the acquisition of resistance. And one is from Spain is asking, if I can say it, just give me a sec. He's asking like some technical questions. So which one is the sequencing depth that you use for targeted sequencing for CTCs?
Okay, so for the copy number analysis that I presented, the sequencing depth for that is about 0.1 times coverage. So you don't sequence the entire genome. So you just need low pass coverage to get your copy number data. If you actually want to do sequencing to identify point mutations, then again, because you're working at the single cell level, so there should only be 2 copies of the actual genome in each single cell, so you don't need to go to the depths that you do for tumor. So again, when we're doing analysis of CTCs at mutational, we tend to sequence it maybe 10, 20-fold, which will give you good enough data.
Okay, thank you. And then following up on that questions, I have some others of the technical questions. So how many CTCs can you isolate for what is a 7.5 milliliter tube of blood? I was just thinking about how many cells you can get, and if you can identify or isolate only one cell, are you able to? So which one is the quality of that?
Yeah. So that's a very good question. So I mean, and we get asked a lot, how many CTCs do you need to look at to be able to get a true picture of what's happening in that patient? So we've not. So what we've tended to do in this study is we've sequenced, so we've analysed every CTC we could initially. So this project started a couple of years ago, where technically it was difficult to isolate many cells. Nowadays we can isolate 30, 40 cells from a patient quite easily. You can even do hundreds if we need to. And the answer really is the more you analyse, the better. The data that we generated came from averaging maybe 5 to 10 cells per patient, and that gives us what looks like a pretty robust classifier. But what we're doing now, we're trying to expand that to maybe 20 or 30 CTCs per patient and see what that data looks like. What you are limited to is the number of CTCs that patient has. Some patients only have maybe 1 CTC or 5 CTCs.
And that depends on the...
And that depends on the disease.
On the disease, the progression of the disease. And then following that question, have you thought about, or the group has thought about using leukapheresis? Because I know in Germany it's been done by, I know Andreas Kramp was showing that in a conference that was recently.
Yeah.
And they were showing that apparently it's something quite routinely. And he was speaking about breast cancer, it wasn't lung cancer, but
yeah.
Do you think it could be implemented in the
Yeah, so it's very interesting. So scientifically, in the lab, it's a very interesting question. And so the problem that you've got with the leukapheresis is, even though you process high volumes of blood, you still end up with quite a high volume of cells physically to then work with. So you end up with 50 mils, and most of these platforms you've got to work at the less than a mil sort of level. So you've got the complication of actually concentrating your cells down following leukapheresis, and also you still get a high contamination of normal cells coming through the leukapheresis. Clinically, the problem with leukapheresis is that you're asking maybe an end-stage cancer patient to undergo leukapheresis. They're not very well anyway, and they've got to sit on the machine for maybe 4 hours to do a leukapheresis, and you can't do that for, that takes away this ability to do repeat longitudinal analysis of these patients. You can't really ask them very easily to sit on a leukapheresis machine for lots of times. But it's certainly a very interesting proposition for things like breast cancer and prostate cancer, or maybe not prostate cancer, but for diseases where the number of CTCs you can isolate or you get to work with or you're identifying patients can be limited. It's also very potentially interested in, so CTCs can be enriched positively according to EpCAM expression, for instance, or they can also be isolated epitope independently. So the question is, how do you know you've got enough cells? And so using leukapheresis potentially gives you the chance to answer that sort of question. Okay,
I'm glad that you mentioned EpCAM, because that's the following question that we have. It's all the CTCs express EpCAM.
So no, it's not. It's known that not all CTCs express EpCAM, but EpCAM to date is the best marker we've got for a CTC. So all the data that are presented from the small cell lung cancer, all those CTCs were EpCAM positive because they went through the cell search machine. In non-small cell lung cancer, us and others have shown that there are quite a large population of CTCs which are EpCAM negative. But the question with that is, how do you isolate those? So you can use, as I just said, epitope-independent mechanisms. So you can use filtration devices which allow you to, so CTCs tend to be bigger than normal cells, and so you can put them through filters and they get stuck in the filters, and then you can try and rescue them and do the analysis from that. And us and others are doing that sort of approach.
Okay. And then I have 2 questions related to the last part of your talk, and that will be the last couple of questions. So the first one is, how long does it take to generate that CDX model? That would be a patient that I've sent over from a CTC.
Yes.
How many CTCs you have to inject? Or you inject only 1 CTC?
So we don't know. So the way we do our CDX is that we do a negative selection for the CTC. So basically we select for all the cells, and whatever's left over, all the marker positive cells, we select for and throw away, and whatever cells which are left over, which are hopefully our CTCs, we inject into the mouse. So we never actually quantify the total number of CTCs that we put into a mouse. So what we do is we take a parallel blood sample and quantify the CTCs from there on a Veridexis machine. And so I can't remember from our publication, but I think there was a threshold of success. We only got successful CDX generated when patients had above 100 CTCs. So quite a high CTC burden to actually get. But again, that's disease specific. So we've generated our CDX from small cell lung cancer patients. People are trying it in prostate and trying it in breast cancer. And again, the number of CTCs you need for that can be dependent on the disease type.
Okay, and the last question is about the target trial and that panel of 653 genes that you were showing. And when do you think that molecular analysis will be available in the clinic? Because it's quite promising, all the things that you saw.
It is. So I mean, I'm currently writing up the paper. So okay. Hopefully the plan is to submit that maybe at the end of this month, maybe next month. So the clinical outcome that we've got so far is from the 11 patients that we put out of the first 100. Then we got either stable disease or partial responses in all of the patients. It's very difficult to actually determine what the clinical benefit for that was, because you don't have an arm of patients that didn't receive treatment. You can only base it in historical data. But the part B, which I just described then, what we're doing now is we're actually using the actual emphasis of that part of the trial is to put patients onto clinical trial based on ctDNA results, and that will give us a much better insight into the actual clinical utility of that approach.
Okay, thank you very much, Dominic. And now we are gonna start with our second speaker. So now is the turn of Dr. Eloisa Jantús, and Eloisa is the head of the Molecular Oncology Lab at the General Hospital Research Foundation at the University of Valencia in Valencia, Spain. And her research focus is searching novel prognostic biomarkers in resectable lung cancer, and also she has also extensive experience in the analysis of biomarkers using liquid biopsies such as saliva and plasma. So Eloisa, thank you very much for joining, and now this is all yours.
Hello? Hello, can you hear me? Okay, it is my pleasure to be here with you and to share this webinar with Dominic Rothwell. And of course, I would like to thank Aseika and Asruk for their kind invitation. Let me briefly introduce the other type of lung cancer. Dominic talked about small cell lung cancer, and I am going to talk about non-small cell lung cancer, which is the predominant major cause of malignancy-related death in our countries. In the latest, let's say, 2 decades, the landscape of lung cancer has changed a lot. From a traditional view where you can see just one pathology with only one treatment, which was chemotherapy, we go through all these steps until now that we have our current approach is based on an extensive molecular analysis, able to define different subgroup of patients according to their molecular profile. And also druggable genomic alterations increase over time, equally as the complexity for its screening. And EGFR mutations represents around 15% of all adenocarcinomas of the lung, and the most common mutations are deletions in exon 19, and almost 40% of the cases has a punctal mutation, which is so-called L858R, which are the most common mutation found in this gene, in the EGFR gene. Patients harboring mutations in EGFR gene can be treated with targeted therapies based on the inhibition of the tyrosine kinase activity of this receptor. Although TKIs or tyrosine kinase inhibitors targeting the epidermal growth factor receptor have shown effectiveness as therapy for advanced non-small cell lung cancer with mutated EGFR gene, acquired resistance has emerged as a major limitation of these type of targeted therapies. the most important mechanism of acquired resistance is the secondary mutation in the EGFR gene, which is so-called T790M mutation, which is responsible of almost 50% of the cases of resistance, along with other mechanisms such as MLT, histological transformation to small cell lung cancer, or activation of alternative pathway like BRAF, PI3 kinase, PTIN loss, or activation of STEP3. In the present context, the detection of mutation in this gene, in EGFR gene, in lung cancer is mandatory, at least in adenocarcinomas of the lung, and is included in all the guidelines. But still, there are some controversies regarding the right matrix where they have to be analyzed. And the question is the tissue really the issue, or are there some other options, especially in those cases where tissue are unavailable? And the guidelines have not really clarified this point, especially in the cases where resistant mutation has to be analyzed. This is still an unsolved issue, and there are some guidelines that strongly recommend a rebiopsy, whereas in the case of ASCO guidelines, for example, their recommendations are more open, and they recommend that plasma could be a matrix, but also rebiopsy in some other cases. At this point of my talk, the key question is that in this clinical scenario, should we always the tissue testing the standard of care in at least in the resistance setting? And let's talk about this paper that I think that all of you know. This was published last year in New England Journal of Medicine. Remember that in this paper, the data that has published show that at least there is a 30% of intratumor heterogeneity in the samples analysis in this publication. Then the question is, can we rely on tissue biopsy for treatment decision at the time of acquired resistance? And the answer is probably no. The other possibility is to analyze blood samples, liquid biopsy, which is the subject of this webinar. And I think that Dr. Rothwell already explained you the advantages to use liquid biopsy. And particularly in my case, in the case of the study of resistance mechanism, circulating tumor DNA has a lot of advantages and utility, especially in the case of non-small cell lung cancer. And the question here is that, can we rely on liquid biopsy for treatment decision at the time of acquired resistance? And in this sentence, my answer is that probably yes, we can rely on liquid biopsy. In fact, the problem is that if we have a patient that harbor a shedding tumor or a non-shedding tumor. In the case of shedding tumor, liquid biopsy or circulating free DNA can be analyzed, and we find the resistant mutation if the patient has them. But in the case of non-shedding tumor, if we don't find the mutations in the liquid biopsy, we still have the possibility to have a rebiopsy from the tumor and to analyze the resistance mechanism. Then Oxnard, in his paper published in 2016, derived from the data from AURA-1 and AURA-2 clinical trial, proposed that resistant mutations can be analyzed in plasma. And if you find the T790M mutation, if it is positive, you can treat your patient, and the patients will behave exactly the same as if you analyze this mutation in the tissue. If you don't find the mutation, if it is negative, then in this case, you have to request a rebiopsy and test the tissue. In the case of a positive result, you can treat the patient with an inhibitor of this mutation. Or if you don't find the mutation, you can have another options in order to find some other mechanism of resistance. But the problem is how to detect this resistant mutation. There are several approaches, several methodologies. Some of them are more informative and some of them are more sensitive. And in the case that we need more informative techniques, the question that we ask to this technique is which mutations are present, which one? And we have to use this type of techniques when we want to do de novo discovery of actionable targets in patients with cancer or genetic changes underlying therapy resistance. And if the question is how much, or the sensitivity of a technique, how much we have, how much mutated molecules we have in our samples, maybe we have to go to more sensitive techniques like digital PCR. And these techniques allow us to profile dynamically individual mutations, but require a priori knowledge of the mutant allele that we are going to test. Then these are the approaches that we have. If we want more information, we have to go to a panel of gene or whole exome, maybe the panel that Dr. Roth will commented in his presentation, NGS panels. And if we want to know how much we have in order to monitor the disease, we can use these more sensitive techniques like digital PCR. In this case, we are able to analyze one or two, or not more than 2 or 3 genes. The capacity of these techniques to analyze, to multiplex genes is very low. Can we rely on these techniques? In the case of liquid biopsy, sensitivity is an important issue to consider. And using really sensitive methods, we can rescue a lot of patients with this T790M mutation, for example. In this study, for example, using beaming or digital PCR, we were able to determine or to analyze patients and rescue at least 30% of the patients that were negative using real-time PCR techniques. Using the more sensitive techniques were considered positive. Then one of the tests that has been approved by the FDA was a technique based in a real-time PCR, which is not one of the most sensitive tests that we have already in the market. The newer platforms like droplet digital PCR or beaming that are more sensitive really demonstrated that have better concordance results with tissue analysis. Here you have different methods for NGS platforms or for digital PCR that are in the market. And here you have the limit of detection of different methods. you can see that they go from 2% to 0.001%. The sensitivities are really different, and we have to consider this characteristic of the techniques that we are going to use according to the type of question that we want to answer when we analyze a blood sample. And in my case, I am a liquid biopsy believer, and I am going to show you one case of one patient that was treated in our oncology department. This was a 76-year-old woman. She was never a smoker and had no other clinical or pathological signs of interest. In May of 2014, she consulted her doctor with mild symptoms of cough, dyspnea, lumbar pain, and also she referred some pain in her left arm. 1 month later, a CT scan showed a mass in her left upper lobe, in the lung. Bilateral nodules affected, multiple bone lesions in D4, L3, L4, left humerus and femur affected, metastatic lesions, and also a single liver metastasis was observed. Here you can see the mass in the upper lobe and some nodules in both lungs. With these results, we move forward, and a tumor biopsy was obtained, analyzed by our pathologist, and the report described a poor differentiated non-small cell carcinoma of the lung harboring an EGFR mutation. There was an exon, a deletion in exon 19, and the method used for the analysis in tissue was a real-time PCR. Therefore, we have 4 weeks later, we have the diagnosis of our patient. It was a stage 4, poor differentiated lung adenocarcinoma, EGFR mutated. At that moment, we asked for a blood sample in order to analyze the presence of EGFR mutation in circulating free DNA. And using beaming technology, which is a digital PCR technology, we were able to find the mutation in their blood. The mutant fraction at that time was 0.26%, and the number of mutant molecules was 171. The next question is, what is the proportion of agreement between tissue and plasma? And we made this LAMBEAM trial that was a multicentric study called LAMBEAM, performing substitution, and it was the general agreement was 72%. But let's see what happened with the concordant and discordant cases. Discordant cases, in the case of discordant cases, the average number of days between tissue biopsy and blood collection was around 1 year. And this was one point that was discussed before by Dr. Rothwell. Sometimes the tissue biopsy was taken at the time of surgery, and clinical decisions are taken based on tissue samples that were taken 1, 2, or even 3 years ago. You know that the tumors are evolving, and they acquire mutations. In the case of lung cancer, the smoking habit is one of the mutator phenotypes, and this can be one of the causes that are the basis of this discordant result. Well, let's go back to our patients, and according to the guidelines, our patient initiated treatment with the first generation EGFR TKI. In this case was gefitinib, and she started treatment in July of 2014. And let's see what happened. This was the mutant fraction that we found before the starting of the treatment, and 1 month later, the mutant fraction was completely negative. There was a complete clearance of a GFR mutation in the plasma when we analyzed this sample. And the question now is there any clinical utility in the monitoring of mutation in this type of EGFR mutated patient undergoing TKI treatment? And the answer is maybe. In our LangBeam trial, we have seen that those patients that showing a clearance of EGFR mutation in plasma 8 weeks after initiation of EGFR TKIs had a mean PFS of 37 weeks. Compared with the other group of patients with detectable mutation at 8 weeks that has a mean PFS of 28 weeks. Then the clearance of EGFR mutation in plasma could be a favorable indicator for PFS. Then it has prognostic value in our study. What happened with our patients? In the first response evaluation, you can see here, this was the initial CT scan lesions, and these are the status of the lesion at the first evaluation. You can see there a reduction in the size of all lung lesions. Some nodules were completely disappeared, and there was also a reduction in the size of liver metastases, and there was a stabilization of bone metastases. Then our patient undergone what we call a partial response to the treatment. Well, he continued with gefitinib, and in December she presented a hepatic toxicity. We analyzed also the blood sample at that time, and the sample was completely negative for EGFR mutation. CT scans confirmed that there were no progressive disease, and the oncologist decided to switch the treatment to erlotinib, and she continued with erlotinib for 2 years. And you can see that in the follow-up, all the samples were completely negative for the EGFR mutation in their liquid biopsy. But in April 2017, after 24 months of treatment, new mediastinal lymphadenopathies occur, along with pleural effusion and new right para-aortic adenopathies in renal ileum, even though the patient was not symptomatic, preferring just mild lumbar pain and a grade 1 asthenia. In this scenario, the patient refused any invasive technique for biopsy, and therefore we decided to take a blood sample and to analyze these samples using an NGS method. We use the Garden platform, which is a panel that covers 73 genes, analyze these gene copy numbers and fusion, rearrangement, and index in other 23 genes. And as you can see, we can find a resistant mutation, the T790M mutation in the blood sample of our patient. We decided to know how much of this resistant mutation, we were able to find in their blood samples. And we take another sample. So it was taken in May 2017. And we detect a mutant fraction of the sensitizing mutation, 0.9%, but also we were able to detect the T790M mutation. The mutant fraction was 0.4%. And you can see the number of mutant molecules, 318, 140 at T7. At least half of the mutant fraction was harboring this resistant mutation. And according to this resistance mechanism, the patient was invited to participate in a clinical trial, and she was included in this trial that was open in our oncology department and at that moment. And she received osimertinib as a single agent. Osimertinib is a third generation TKI that is able to overcome this resistance mechanism in exon 20. She started the osimertinib in July last year, and these were the mutant fraction that we found in liquid biopsy before the initiation of osimertinib. And you can see after 1 month of treatment, there was a dramatically drop of the sensitizing and resistant mutation in liquid biopsy. And that in the monitoring, all the samples remain negative until last month. That was the last sample that we analyzed in this patient. Our patient continues treatment with osimertinib until now. And these are their tags. This is previous to the osimertinib. You can see here the pleural effusion that she has, some nodules. And this is the images previous to the treatment with osimertinib. This is the CTs at the first evaluation. Here you can see the dramatic decrease of this lesion. And the latest response evaluation that was a month ago, practically there is no lesions remaining. It's a completely clean CT scan. Our case, let's go back to our case. We have remember that we are talking about stage 4, poor differentiated blood cancer. Before targeted therapies, the overall survival for these patients were around 9 months. And I am reporting an overall survival of 47 months in this patient. 34 months with the first generation TKI, and 13 months more using a third generation TKI. Data from clinical trials say that using a first, second generation, the overall survival is increasing until 9 to 14 months. And osimertinib using in second line therapies add 10 months more to the overall survival. And well, from my point of view, a drop of blood can give us a lot of valuable information. Liquid biopsies have a key role in the clinical management of oncological patients and is an important player in the implementation of precision medicine. This is my last slide, and well, the future is nice. I think that liquid biopsies are now here and will give us a lot of important information to better manage our patients. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eloisa. We have some questions for you. So
Okay.
the first one is related to the T790M mutation. And it's about this mutation in the primary tumor, or it just appears after acquisition of resistance?
Well, there are some patients around the percentage of patients that have this T790 mutation in the as a primary resistance before TKI treatment is from around 5%. In our department, we have seen 2 patients that has this T790M mutation at the time of diagnosis. We don't know if it is present at the beginning of the disease, and it's a small clone that after treatment emerged as a predominant clone, but T790M mutation has been described in all the publication as one of the resistance mechanisms and emerged after treatment with the first generation TKIs.
Okay, thank you. We have another one about this osimertinib, and is it used as an inhibitor just after all the other ones, EGFR inhibitors, have failed, and if the mutation is present, of course.
Yeah. Well, now there is a clinical trial, which is so-called FLAURA, first-line osimertinib, that has demonstrated that osimertinib used in first-line can also improve survival. There is a lot of debates about how we have to use, if we can have to use this most potent inhibitor at the beginning of the disease, or maybe it's better to use these other TKIs, first generation TKIs at the beginning, and then to use osimertinib in the second or third line of treatment. This question is still open. I don't have an answer in this case.
Okay, thank you. Now, following on the clinical trials, I was just wondering, there is any kind of clinical trial or any kind of idea or discussion within the field about combining EGFR inhibitors? Like in this case, you were saying that this osimertinib sometimes has been used first line, and I was wondering if it's something to know about, if it's been spoken about, if it could be some kind of combination treatment.
There are combination treatment, but not with TKIs plus TKIs, maybe TKIs plus chemo or some other combination. Because in the case of osimertinib, these TKIs is able to inhibit the primary EGFR mutation and also the ones that are related to the resistant, the T790M. Then, because of the mechanism of action of osimertinib, then there is no real sense to combine osimertinib plus one of the first generation TKIs.
Okay, one of the questions that we have is if when you were showing the clinical utility of monitoring the patient, there was a difference on progression-free survival in time. So this person is wondering if you look at overall survival, if there was a it was that one, I think the one before, in which you have I think the title of your slide was about clinical utility of monitoring, I think. That
This
one.
Mhm.
Yeah, so here you speak about there is a difference of like 12 weeks of progression-free survival. What about overall survival? Because sometimes in the clinical trials they look always at the
Well,
an
this is an
endpoint.
ongoing trial. This is a preliminary results that were presented in the World Congress of Lung Cancer last year, and we are now reevaluating the data with the overall survival. We don't have data still regarding overall survival. We just have the data from PFS.
Okay, thank you. And then I think this is more a curiosity. Is how are the clinical meetings? And with that, women, how do you transmit the molecular info that you have about the patient to the clinicians? How those meetings are?
Well, we have a molecular tumor board, as well as Dominic showed in his institution. We, the biologists, share this information with the oncologists. And in the case of detection of these resistant mutations, we inform the patient about well, in this case, when the resistance was radiologically clear, the oncologist asked for a biopsy, a tumor biopsy in this patient, and she refuses to have any invasive procedure. That's why we decided to see if we can see the resistance mechanism in liquid biopsy. And we inform our patient about what we find in the analysis. And in this case, there was a clinical trial open in our institution, and we invite the patient to participate in the clinical trial. She was informed about all the benefits and the possible secondary effects that she will have, and she decided to participate in the trial. And well, it was a case of success because the patient is alive with a good quality of life, and well, she's visiting us every month.
That's really good. And then I have a last question that is about when you are analyzing all these mutations and you're getting all these different samples to monitoring the disease, how long can you, or by law, is you need to storage this sequencing data? There is any kind of law that regulates this, or how does it work? And where do you get that? Where did you keep that information?
We have an informed consent from the patient because we use these samples also for research purpose. Then we have a collection, and part of these samples are stored in a biobank because we are a source for where we can find some other things and for resources for research. Then in the case of biobank, they can be stored as much as you have samples in order to be analyzed. There are no other regulations in order to store in a biobank.
Okay. Thank you very much to you, Eloisa, and also to Dominic for give us this nice webinar and this nice overview about liquid biopsies. And thanks to all the attendees as well. I hope to see you soon in the next webinar. So please keep looking at our website because we're having more interesting topics coming up after the summer. And see you soon.
Good summer for everyone. See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.